Family Skeptical, Parenting Through Nonbelief.
We're a married atheist couple raising two wonderful, strange children. We ask big questions, dissect weird parenting moments, and examine how society ignores or misrepresents families like ours. If you're any stripe of nonbeliever who's involved in raising children, welcome. You are our people.
Our kids have heard all our swears, but yours might not have, so be thoughtful if there are young people listening with you.
Happy post-Thanksgiving, moms.
Yeah, this is the first time we've recorded since the election.
True.
And since our trip for Thanksgiving, we did like a almost 7-hour drive back from seeing my family. And I don't know, I'm exhausted.
Yeah, unplugging from the election, actually, unplugging from national news is something that a lot of people seem to have done, to the extent that some outlets are like setting their hair on fire about this is the death of corporate media, when in point of fact, most people are just burnt out and they're sort of like gathering their strength for the next 4 years. And I think that it's really funny is that's all it took was a little break for mental health for everybody to think that an entire media structure is collapsing under its own weight or due to, being rendered invalid by somebody winning an election cycle. We live in a strange time in which the people that sell us information feel entitled to our attention. And I think that going into this holiday season, if anything, I think we should continue what we did collectively, or I would say in great numbers over Thanksgiving, which is just unplug. Because ultimately, like if you are politically anywhere close to where we are, then you have concerns about the world at large, ecology and economics and human rights. And one, you're not, if you don't have the energy to muster some sort of defense in the form of either like keeping up with news and donating or marching or volunteering your time, or maybe running for public office, or, starting some sort of campaign against some sort of, socio-political ill. Since all of that requires energy, and since the people that are going to be affected negatively over the next couple of years require your energy, I think it behooves us to just continue to maybe take a step back, to pay attention just enough, because ultimately the election is done. Your causes are still going to be sending you fundraising emails, the ones you haven't had stop already. And you can stay plugged in a cursory fashion, but giving yourself that grace of time to sort of like shore up your own psychic defenses. I don't know, like I feel refreshed. I know that some people don't, but I don't feel beaten down at all. In fact, this drive is a lot easier than the drive would have been had we been at our previous home.
That's true.
So I am physically refreshed, but I'm also sort of like mentally refreshed.
Well, I am
sorry,
not.
I know, I'm sorry. I can't speak for both of us.
And therefore, I am very glad that we actually do not have to record for a long time, because we have an amazing interview to share with you. But before we get to that, I wanted to tell one story from the trip. The trip.
It was a good trip.
It was a really good trip.
The boys were amazing. Reader and Go were just troopers and amazingly stoic as needed and very loving. Got so many pictures of them like hugging each other on sofas. And it was very, in a sense, idyllic.
Yeah. But on the way out, we were driving. And in the last episode, we talked about, what we would tell the kids if we were someplace where our lack of belief might cause some blowback for them. Yeah. And I was just curious. So I asked them on the drive how they would want to handle the situation. Mm-hmm. And I thought it was interesting because Reader said he wouldn't want to lie, mm-hmm. but his reason is that he was scared people would ask more questions that he couldn't answer. Mm-hmm. And he understood that would create just more blowback. Like if he lied and then it was clear he was lying, that would have been worse than telling the truth in the first place. Mm. And so he's like, I'd rather not have the stress of keeping up the lie or not lying well. Mm-hmm. And so I would just tell people, which I thought was very pragmatic.
Yes.
And
very admirable.
And
brave.
And brave and also just speaks to how hard this is for families. Yeah. Because even if you choose to go kind of under the radar, that's not necessarily the easiest thing.
Yeah. I take it as a challenge that I have to train him to speak their language well enough. That he lacks the confidence to lie now. So I have to give him the confidence to lie. So he can survive in a theocratic police state that's coming.
Well, if anybody's going to teach him, it should be me.
Why?
Have I told you this? Like, I was such a good liar, I stopped lying because I felt like it was just like an unhealthy thing to do. Okay. I was like, I can do this incredibly well, but this is like not how I want to exist in the world.
That's great, but I don't know if you speak their lingo.
This is true. Though, like the fun thing for me, and this makes my parenting sound incredibly sad, but like Reader wanted to talk to me so much this trip. It is so rare that Reader has something to say to me. And there were like things.
Maybe if you lied more, he would care.
Yeah. But he wanted, I got him to talk about Squid Game because he started watching Squid Game.
Yeah, God help us.
And then somehow we got on the topic of like what you do if you see a famous person. And if you go up and say hello, or like, do you ask for an autograph? And he like engaged and let me babble on for like 30 minutes and actually seemed pleased to be having the conversation with me.
Or he was just bored.
Yeah, very possible.
Yeah. No, I heard the conversation.
It was fun. We had the pleasure of speaking with Paul Golin, who is the executive director of the Society for Humanistic Judaism. And this was such a lovely conversation. Paul has worked for nearly 2 decades with Jewish organizations, and now is doing amazing work with the society. This really spoke to me as a secular Jew. And I think a lot of people in my family are going to look forward to this one. So I'm going to be messaging people about it. Usually I'd go through a big intro, but Paul did an amazing job kind of walking us through his career while we were talking with him. So I will let him do that. And I might sound a little bit weird because I had all of the technical difficulties during this interview, and Paul was just a total gentleman for putting up with us. But check it out. I think you're going to like it. So, Paul, it is so wonderful to have you here.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, we met back this year, at the beginning of the year, at the American Atheist Convention. And your talk was so great that Pops and I just knew we had to have you on the podcast. So to start things off, would you be interested in telling us your secular superhero origin story, how you became or realized that you were non-religious, and or how you decided to become a more active voice in the secular humanist community?
Sure. I don't ever remember believing in the supernatural, but I do remember when I realized that I don't believe in the supernatural. And I was maybe 10 or 11, and it happened ironically at a Jewish sleepaway camp. I grew up.
I love that. Like, this is, we shared the same origin story.
Okay.
Way to religious camps for making all the atheists realize they're atheists.
I don't think they would, they were I describe them as a Zionist indoctrination camp. They would not, they would say Jewish, and I don't think they would say religious, right? So that's a whole other separate conversation, is about Jews and being not religious, but being Jewish. But this camp, was upstate New York. And unlike where I grew up on Staten Island, New York, where there's so much light pollution, upstate New York, I got to see the full sky, the stars. And at the same time, I was into science and science fiction. I was learning about the size of the universe and time and all of these big ideas. And it was not jibing with what I was learning every week in Hebrew school. And I had nobody to talk to about that. And I was having what I now realize were probably panic attacks, where I would be thinking about, at night alone, thinking about infinity and death and, nothingness, all of these big concepts. And I had nobody to discuss it with. And then when I come back and resume Hebrew school 3 times a week, because it was conservative synagogue, I just knew I couldn't bring this up. I couldn't talk to the rabbi about not believing in God. There was no conversation at that time. I think it happens more today. This is, the late 70s, early 80s. It was just presumed that this is what Jews believe. So it was alienating and isolating to know that I didn't believe, but I was still going through the motions in this religious community in preparation for my bar mitzvah. So I was very frustrated and thought I was going to drop this giant bombshell on my mom when I told her, now I'm like age 12 and just miserable about preparing for my bar mitzvah, which I describe as memorizing a bad song in a language I don't understand. Mm-hmm. And that was the Haftorah portion. I was using a cassette player, which you may have to explain to your younger listeners what that is, of a guy who recorded my Haftorah, and I was just memorizing, mimicking him. And I thought the whole thing was completely a stupid waste of time. And so I was going to drop this big bombshell on her, and I said, I'm not having a bar mitzvah because I don't believe in God. And she said, well, I don't either, and you're having a bar mitzvah. And I had to stop and think about, why does she care? Why are we doing this? And more importantly, why is she a Jewish communal professional? Because she had spent her entire career working at the Jewish community centers. If she also didn't believe in God, and I knew the answer without really having to talk about it, because she was born in Berlin after World War II in a displaced persons camp, because her parents had survived the war, had lost everybody else in their families, and we were cultural Jews. We were not religious Jews. And inherently I knew that, but there had been no conversation about it. I look at photos of my grandparents with their multiple siblings, all of whom died in the war in the 1930s. And they were Bundists, which was the Yiddish secularist socialist movement in Poland. They're all in like these black t-shirts, turtlenecks, looking very serious in these photos. None of them looked religious. None of them men had beards, right? None of the indicators of Jewish religion in those photos in the 30s. So I feel like I'm at least 3rd generation Jewish atheist, but the connection to being Jewish is still very powerful for me. And I just, after bar mitzvah, it really was graduation out of Jewish religion, as it is for so many American Jews. And instead, I looked for other ways to connect to Jewish identity, Jewish ethnicity, Jewish culture, trying to be as open as I could about being atheist and secular.
And then how did that, sort of turn into a career in this bigger part of your life?
Oh, completely accidentally. I had worked in TV here in New York. I was a complete peon at HBO Studio Productions, but it was cool because I got some famous people sandwiches in between, takes and stuff like that. And it was exciting. And I went from there to a multimedia company and we were making CD-ROM games, which should put a date on when this was. And we worked on this amazing game. And, but it was a startup company, one of the first to go public in what was being called Silicon Alley in Manhattan, and one of the first to go bankrupt when the game was not an absolute blockbuster and we had spent all this money. So I was out of work, and that's when this second career started for me in the Jewish community, because I went to a headhunter, and at the bottom of my resume, she saw volunteer work at the Jewish Community Center of Staten Island. And because you can't flat out ask in a interview, are you Jewish? But she saw JCC. She placed me at a foundation that was run by a major Jewish philanthropist. That wasn't quite the right fit, but I learned a lot. And after a year and a half, I learned of an organization that was helping the Jewish community better engage interfaith families. And that was right up my alley, because it was personal, and it related to my ideas around Judaism as a culture and an ethnicity, but not a religion. You know, monotheistic religions are exclusive, and culture is inclusive. You can do as much culture as you want. And I figured I was headed for intermarriage myself. I wasn't married at that time, but I am now, and I am intermarried. And so this was very much on mission for me. And I worked at that organization for 16 years in various titles. I think we did help move the needle in the Jewish community. I think the Jewish community is more inclusive. There's still a lot of work to do. But when I started, there was still debate about, should we welcome interfaith families? That debate outside of Orthodoxy basically is over. And the question now is, how do we do it? And so I'm glad that that moved. I'm glad that there's greater acceptance. But I'm really glad now to be working in the Humanistic Judaism movement, where there are no barriers at all. There's no restrictions on what the partner who isn't Jewish can or can't do ritually, because again, once you remove the religious component and the privilege that provides for Jews alone over people who aren't Jewish, everyone can participate because it's a cultural, not a religious ceremony or ritual. And so I've been at the Society for Humanistic Judaism for 8 years now, and welcoming interfaith families is still very much part of the mission. And I'm just excited that we're able to do that in this cultural way, because I think most interfaith couples are either both secular or one is secular. Generally, if it's one that's secular, the other gets to decide what the religion is, but not always, because I know lots of couples where it is the Jewish partner that is completely secular, and the other partner who does have a religion is the one who says, we have to raise our kids with some religion. And then the secular Jew says, okay, then it'll be Judaism, right? So that sets up an interesting dynamic, because, and I've met with many couples in this scenario where the non-Jewish spouse is wondering, you know, like, how does this work if you are Jewish, don't have belief in the religious part of it, and now we're going to educate our kids religiously, but only in this, because you know, the Jewish partner can't tolerate having Christian believing kids, right? The couples where both are secular can do Christmas and Hanukkah. You know, there's no real conflict because Jesus is absent from most Christmas celebrations, right? Mm-hmm. So, you know, that is not the tension. The tension is, are you going to do the religious rituals of the other religion? And for a lot of secular Jews, that's intolerable. But if the spouse really wants religion in the household, then, you know, then they're going to say, all right, I'll do it if it's Judaism.
So there are spouses of other religions who care so much about religion that they need it in their household, but they're willing to do a different one?
When at my old organization, which no longer exists, sadly, but it was called the Jewish Outreach Institute, and then it became Big Tent Judaism. We created a program called the Mother Circle for women who were not Jewish, who were raising Jewish children. And we reached thousands of them. And it was remarkable because, first of all, it was in recognition that in America today, whether fair or not, and I think it's unfair, women generally still take the greater responsibility for the education of children. So we recognize that. And we also recognize that they, in many cases, were willing to forego their own religion but they wanted their kids to have some religion. And this happens now, certainly in the Reform movement. It's tens, if not hundreds of thousands of households where you've got somebody, a spouse, often the woman, at least 50% is probably higher Jewish man, woman from another background, raising Jewish kids, and these folks are not Jewish. And what some of the interesting feedback I heard, one piece was that they were amazed there's no God talk in their like Reform synagogue. I'm like, the first time I heard that, I'm like, that's odd, because like every fourth word of the liturgy is God. And like, no, of course, all the prayers mention God, but the rabbi never talks about it, right? The sermons are always about Israel or politics or something, meaningful for human existence, but never about our relationship with God. And, of course, we know the reason why, which is you're going to alienate all the non-believers sitting in front of you if you do that outside of the Orthodox community and maybe within the Orthodox community.
Wow. That I love learning something new. This is like a whole community I didn't realize existed.
Oh, yeah.
That is fascinating.
Yeah, because the only narrative that we ever really hear is kids are Jewish because of their maternal heritage.
Right.
And so the idea of just having a non-Jewish mother to Jewish kids, like not by adoption, or would they just be like marrying?
Well, first of all, let me dispel that, because in 1983, the Reform movement accepted patrilineal descent as well as matrilineal descent. And actually, the Reconstructionist movement, which is even smaller, had gone first in, I think, 1979. Humanistic Judaism never had that. Our definition of who's a Jew is very different, which I'll mention in a moment. But the bottom line is that today in America, at least half, if not more, of American Jews will accept people as Jewish, regardless of which parent is Jewish. And I think many Jews would agree with the definition that secular humanistic Judaism established in 1988 formally. It's on our website. If you go to shj.org/who, WHO, anybody who says they're Jewish and connects sincerely to Jewish culture, history, community, even religion, for us, we're not gonna police who says they're Jewish by asking for your papers. If you say you're Jewish, that's great. We actually have an adoption program, which is our version of conversion for people who want some kind of formal recognition of it. But we always tell them, if you say you're Jewish, we accept you as Jewish. And then if you do want some kind of formal certificate, we're happy to send it to you. It's generally accepted by the Reform and Reconstructionist movement. Maybe not everywhere in the conservative movement, certainly not accepted by the Orthodox movement. I've heard mixed results about people trying to use that certificate to become a citizen of Israel. But the point is, for us, it's about self-identification. Okay. And we don't want to get into the whole who's a Jew debate. But yes, many people walk around, and I've met folks who've said, when I tell them what I do for work, they're like, well, I'm not really Jewish because it's my dad who's Jewish. And I hate hearing that. I'm like, if you want to be Jewish, you are. Just own it, just say it. And, like in Israel, you can become a citizen of Israel if one of your grandparents is Jewish. They haven't abolished that yet. There's some talk about doing that. But still to this day, it's 1/4 on either side, right? Because that was the criteria that Hitler was using. So when they set it up as a safe haven, they wanted to use the same criteria. And yet, if you, it is still very complicated because the Orthodox run religion in Israel. If you, like, let's say you come there there was a huge wave of Russians who came to Israel. Many fought in the Israeli Defense Forces. Some were killed. If their mother wasn't Jewish, they couldn't be buried in a Jewish cemetery. Even though they had become citizens, they, fought and died on behalf of the Jewish state, and yet that religious piece. So we don't get caught up in any of that. If people are Jewish, say you're Jewish. And then, of course, the other pushback is, well, what if they say they're Jewish, but they still believe in Jesus, right? Again, people always want to find the extreme, rare examples, but it does happen. And if someone tells me that, they're Jewish, but they believe in Jesus, I just say, well, how does that work for you? Right? Like tell me more. And what I've heard was, I'm Jewish ethnically or I'm Jewish culturally, but I believe, right? So the religious belief is from another religion, but the cultural and ethnic identity is from Judaism. Whatever works for you. The origin of Judaism is tribalism, right? People still say, are you a member of the tribe? Jokingly, about being Jewish. But I don't find it particularly funny because tribalism in its rawest form, I find, is something that humanity kind of needs to get past, because I'm a universalist. So I think that in many places, tribalism was superseded by nationalism. I don't think nationalism is such a great thing. Certainly, not in the US the way it's being expressed these days. And I would love to see us I'm one of those globalists that they're warning you about. There's Jewish globalist is kind of a code word for Jews. And there's a reason why. It's because Jews are a global people. And we see the benefit in getting past the xenophobia and ethnocentrism that's been pretty much, it has kept us as a Jewish community for a long time, but it's been weaponized against us for a long time too. And I, as somebody who is interfaith, I guess, even though my wife is secular, I'm intermarried, I'm interracially married, I'm internationally married. I don't want to have to abide by anybody else's borders.
So we've talked about it enough, and I know you probably do this all the time, but for those people who don't know, what is Humanistic Judaism? And can you tell us a little bit more about what the Society for Humanistic Judaism is doing?
Sure. Well, as I said, by age 10 or 11, I knew I didn't believe in God. I came to recognize I'm still Jewish, had to figure out what that means. And I wish I had known at that time that there was a group out in suburban Detroit and a couple of other communities, but nowhere near me, that were practicing Judaism without God. And so Humanistic Judaism was founded in the mid-60s by a Reform rabbi named Sherwin Wine, who came out as atheist publicly. He didn't call himself atheist, but he was labeled atheist by Time magazine, which did a little blurb on him and called him the atheist rabbi. And he got a little bit of notoriety. He got kicked out of his rabbinic association for a couple of years, not because he was necessarily saying something that his colleagues didn't believe, but just that they didn't want him to say it openly because he was kind of spoiling the gig for them. At that time, most Reform rabbis were not theistic. I think that's changed. I think Reform movement has actually become more religious over the past couple of decades. But he did not want to keep saying words that he didn't believe. He felt that words are an expression of your authenticity and that the Jewish liturgy was not authentic to what he believed. So he rewrote, and this was the one real innovation in our movement, he rewrote Jewish liturgy to remove God and the supernatural and replace it with humanism. Now, I had never heard the word humanism till well into adulthood. Sadly, annoyingly, I wish I had, because it described the ethical philosophy that I had just kind of come to on my own, which is that, first of all, the golden rule is the golden rule because it's in every society and it is logic more than religion. Don't do things to other people that you don't want them to do to you. Makes a lot of sense. And it's the foundation for human society from way before it got written down. So those kind of ideas about what is best for most people, how do we treat other people and so on, all of these ideas have already been codified in humanism without this threat of divine retribution if you don't do it. And so what he did was take the humanist philosophy that had already been out there. American Humanist Association, I think, is 90 years old, and overlay that on Jewish liturgy. So if you go, Humanistic Judaism, for folks who grew up Jewish, looks very similar. You will go to Shabbat services, right? The Jewish Sabbath. You will see in many of our communities rabbis. They will be reciting liturgy. They will be lighting candles. They will be saying blessings over bread. But the words that they're using don't thank God or mention God. They reference the benefits and values of a humanistic philosophy. If we're thankful for wine, it's because somebody made this wine, and so we want to be thankful that for the people who brought us this wine, not because it magically appeared. So that idea has enabled tens of thousands of Jewish households over the last 60 years to continue to celebrate Jewish holidays, find meaning in, like, for example, Yom Kippur, which is the Jewish Day of Atonement. And for humanistic Jews, it is not because we're afraid God is going to write us out of the book of life, which is the liturgy of that day. And we don't spend the whole day begging God for forgiveness, which is the liturgy, traditional liturgy for that day. Instead, it is a reflection of how did we do this past year and how can we do better in the coming year, which is just a universal approach to a day of reflection and atonement and at the new year, which is, this is during the period of the Jewish New Year. So he enabled many families who didn't want to say those traditional words to continue celebrating Jewish holidays and life cycle events like bar and bat mitzvah, funerals, births, celebrations, and so on. For the sliver of Jews who really feel strongly about the words that they say, it was really relevant. For many other Jews who believe as we do, they may still be comfortable either being in synagogue settings because it's not about what you're saying. It's about lots of other things like the community, or they like the rabbi, or there's lots of reasons why people may belong to a synagogue and not believe in God. Many Jews don't belong to a synagogue at all, don't do anything Jewishly, religiously, and it may stem from their philosophy. And we'd like to reach them and say that you don't have to throw it all away. There may be a benefit to being part of a community where you can speak openly about what you do believe and what your values are, and still kind of celebrate your heritage and tradition in a more, what I would argue, a more honest way. Certainly more honest for people like me who don't believe in the God of the Bible, certainly, or I don't believe in any other man-made ideas around God. And then as far as what the society does, we are the umbrella organization for about 33 communities or congregations that we were organized in the 70s and 80s as a congregational denomination. It was working well at that time. It doesn't work as well anymore because people don't want to join. Certainly not the people we're trying to reach. They don't want to join at an annual membership as much as they used to. But I would argue that it's been demonstrated that there's a value in being part of a community beyond just your family and friends. And that's the argument we need to make. And I try to make with the way that we're organized. And at the same time, we're creating parallel tracks for people to get involved who may not want to join a congregation, but want to be involved in humanistic Judaism in other ways. So we have a social justice initiative. We do life cycle events directly, like we have a cultural bar mitzvah program for folks who want their kids to have a bar mitzvah, but don't want to be involved in in-person community necessarily. So it's like remote learning, and we can set people up with tutors for that and so on. So we're looking for ways to kind of innovate beyond just the congregational model, while at the same time continuing to offer and strengthen that model for folks for whom it still works.
Yeah, I find that really interesting because one of the big justifiable criticisms of deconversion from any sort of organized religion is that religion, whether or not it's true, offers community. And there's a lot of support through that community. And that's one of the big things that keeps people in religion, is that idea of losing that community feels like it's too much to bear. And so I think it's really cool that your organization is seeking to not even sidestep, but more like embrace head on that need by making something that is very specific to a subset of secular culture that allows for sort of the best of both worlds. I'm jealous. That's really cool.
Thank you. Well, I think that it is, hopefully there'll be a growing recognition, but I think that it's challenging to be in community with people, and we shouldn't downplay that. And we shouldn't say it's so easy. And I would never say just walk through our doors one time and all of a sudden you will feel like you have your community, because that very rarely happens. Mm-hmm. And I think it is a kind of false advertising that leads people to try things once or twice and then not feel embraced and leave. And so on our side of things, I work with our communities to make sure that they actually do welcome newcomers in the ways that newcomers need to be welcomed. And this is across the board. So in my previous organization, when we were working across denominations, I worked on these issues of how do you actually welcome people? How do you make them feel comfortable the first time they walk through your doors? Because the Jewish community is notoriously awful about that, right? It is cliquish. It is, like you will be, I've done this many times, certainly through my work at my previous organization. I walk through the doors of an organization. Like, let's say the Shabbat service ends and there's a tradition to go, it's called Oneg Shabbat, and there's like cookies and, the challah, and you go into another room and you have snacks or whatever. And you, as a newcomer, you walk into that room, people turn, they see that they don't know who you are, and then they turn back to the conversation that they were in. Right? Geez. And it happens all the time. And so then the question is, whose responsibility is it? Right? They're there to schmooze with their friends. So is it on them, or is it on me as a newcomer to have to break into somebody else's conversation to introduce myself? I think the answer is no in both cases. I think the answer is that community needs to find the folks who are going to volunteer to commit to go up and talk to any face that they don't recognize immediately. Like, and this is not for everybody, because there are tons of curmudgeons everywhere. So don't put your curmudgeon in charge of the welcoming committee. And I've seen that happen too. You want happy, outgoing people to commit to go talk to the people that they see who they don't recognize. These are, the regulars should be out there immediately welcoming and then introducing you as a newcomer. If that happens, which is the best case scenario, it still doesn't mean that all of a sudden you're like, oh, I found my place. That evolves over time. And so I would say to folks who are newcomers, give it a chance, give it some time, do it a few times, see if you can find the people that you connect with, because it's hard and it doesn't happen instantaneously. But I think what can happen instantaneously, and I've heard feedback where this does, is for people to say, I've never been to a bar mitzvah like this, and I wish I had known about it for my own kids, right? Because they're, for the first time after going to tons of bar mitzvahs, they are at one where they don't feel like they have to read something into the words, where they can just accept the words as written, right? I spent my entire childhood trying to make the word God mean something else, right? And I get it. It's this kind of mental gymnastics. So, okay, God is going to mean everything good in the world, or God is going to mean all that I love, my friends and family, and that's the thing that I'm going to wish for, and so on. I don't want to have to do that kind of mental gymnastics, and we don't make people do that. The words that, whether it's poetry, whether it's actual quotes from great people who have said amazingly smart things. When I go to some of the services in our movement, like the high holidays, I'm inspired by the words, and I don't have to make them mean something that they weren't intended to mean. They mean what they actually say. And that's kind of exciting for people who are experiencing it for the first time. But again, it doesn't mean that all of a sudden you're being embraced by these whole new set of friends, right? That takes time. So that's one of the great challenges of building community. And it's why I think secular folks have been challenged to do that. So there are secular communities and that are organized along congregational lines. Some of them have lasted for a really long time, like the ethical culture movement, which, if you know a little about them, they were actually founded by a rabbi's son, I think over 100 years ago. And, I think they do some really interesting stuff, but they really universalized it, right? So they didn't retain any culture from anywhere. They created something new. So that may be less sticky for some people. And then there are new groups that have sprung up, like Sunday Assembly. And I think that part of the challenge is the thinking that, community is just going to automatically become strong and powerful. And it takes a lot of work to do. But the other advantage that religion has that we don't is guilt and obligation. And that was a big part of the work that I did at my previous organization too, was to help the Jewish community understand that that is gone. People don't feel that anymore, right? People don't feel like they have to belong to a synagogue, even if they only go 3 days a year. There was an expression, 3-day-a-year Jew, because they only came, and it was all within 1 month. They came for the 2 services for Rosh Hashanah and the 1 for Yom Kippur. And they would be paying these synagogue memberships in the thousands of dollars because they felt this obligation. And that obligation is gone. And so now it has to be about meaning and community and value and benefit and all of those things. And that makes it harder for the organization, but it makes it way better when you actually accomplish it, and certainly better for the end user. But a lot of people have just left and are not coming back. And it's a real challenge, certainly in the Jewish community, to engage folks like that when they have been so turned off. And some of it is just sheer boredom. I was certainly bored out of my skull in Sunday school, but a lot of it is religion. You know, they don't want anything to do with religion. And some of it is really awful stuff, like rabbis who you grew up with, the rabbi who bar mitzvahed you, and then you go back with your spouse and have that rabbi tell you, I can't officiate at your wedding because your spouse isn't Jewish, which happens over and over and over again, continues to happen today, but happened in huge numbers in the 90s and 2000s. So, those kind of things, once people are turned off, it's really hard to re-engage them. So that's also part of the work, is to say, we're doing things differently.
I don't know. I find that so inspiring, because just thinking about the election just happened, right? And so I've certainly been thinking about ways to be in more community with other secular folks, because I feel like we're going to need to be talking about what's going on. And so just that reminder that it really takes work and it's not going to be easy, I feel is like such a powerful reminder for this time, because a lot of people have a lot of motivation, I think right now, and to think about that moving forward, is really helpful for me.
It's not going to be easy. And in fact, it's going to be a lot harder. We are in a really cool position, I think, at the Society for Humanistic Judaism, because we do have our one foot in a different world each. So one of our feet is in the Jewish community, and we sit on what is called the Jewish Social Justice Roundtable. And if people Google that and look at the organizations that are involved in the Jewish Social Justice Roundtable, it's a network of organizations that care about progressive values and issues. And it includes all of the non-Orthodox denominations like Reform and Reconstructionism, but it also includes great social justice organizations like Bend the Arc and Jews for Racial and Economic Justice, and lots of other groups. And we're privileged to sit with them. And at the same time, our other foot is as a member of the Secular Coalition for America, which, if folks Google that, they can see a list of other amazing organizations in the secular organizing world, like American Atheists and American Humanist Association and Freedom from Religion Foundation, who are working on the same issues from a secular perspective. And what's remarkable is the Jewish organizing world, certainly on issues within the United States, the progressive Jewish organizing world and the secular organizing world has no daylight between it as far as the issues. Reproductive rights and LGBTQ equality, and even, I would say, secular education in public schools are all issues that we care about, and they all stem from separation of church and state. We at SHJ, the reason why we're on these tables is because we have a social justice initiative called Jews for a Secular Democracy that brings Jewish perspectives, and it's pluralistic. So we will work with religious Jews as well as secular Jews to bring our different perspectives to these issues, to demonstrate that this, what is now in great political power right now, which is white Christian nationalism, and it's discriminatory toward Jews, religious and secular Jews, by imposing their version of Christianity on the rest of us. And I say their version because there are also great groups like Catholics for Choice and Christians Against Christian Nationalism, who will readily point out how theirs is not really the universal understanding of Christianity. So yeah, finding like-minded people to be in community is more important than ever when there is going to be a lot more oppression in this country for people who aren't white male Christian nationalists.
The silver lining of that is that they are so exclusionary in their approach that it kind of makes it even easier to find allies, right? Like people, like groups that 10, 20 years ago you wouldn't think would be such easy allies to make, now seem to be. And that's just from my lay perspective in talking to people online, like people that with whom I have a fundamental disagreement with this or that social issue, nonetheless will agree that, the way forward is not to like white Christian wash the entire country.
Right.
Because that flies in the face of one of the things that makes the country great. And that diversity of thought can't go away, because that's a hallmark of not only our political system, but our public education system, and it needs to be preserved. And I don't know, like because Rabbi Wine keeps coming up. And one of the things I wanted to ask you about is I increasingly find myself to be sort of agnostic, in that I find it increasingly difficult to put my finger on a definition of what a God could, should, would be. And it makes it very difficult for me without starting every conversation by deferring to my conversant about what their definition of God is, because that's what I would discuss, that I don't really have one of my own, because it seems so weird to think about and so outside of our abilities as human beings to even conceive of. And so I didn't know if, considering that Rabbi Wine started, as it were, the secular Jewish or the Jewish humanistic movement, do you have any thoughts on igtheism, agnosticism?
Yeah, I think it's a clever spin, but it hasn't been adopted widely enough for me to actually use it. But I think it brings up a really important point, which is the words themselves, if they have different meanings to different people, need to be defined before you're in conversation. Otherwise, you could just be talking over each other's heads. So when I present, and I haven't yet, and I did use the word atheist, and I should have, I want to define what that means. And when I say I'm atheist, it means I don't believe in the God of the Bible, which is a written, described God, or any other God that human civilizations have worshipped, right? I don't believe in any of those as truth. As far as what else might exist in the universe, I'm agnostic, because I don't know, but I don't think anyone else does either. And I believe the only way humanity is ever going to find out is through the scientific method, and not by digging through ancient texts of our ancestors. I don't think they knew. I don't think we know. I do think that there is a path to increased knowledge, and I think it's through the scientific method and using the best of human brain power, including emotions and sensibilities, and even spirituality, which is a word that I'm not afraid to use, again, as long as I can define it as chemical reactions in my body. Like, I don't think spirituality is something that's happening to me from outside of me. Like if I'm listening to great music, that music is happening outside of me, but the feelings I'm getting are all happening inside of me. They will end when I end, which is very sad to me, but that's the way I think it is. And I can do something with that. That could inspire me to do something, and that is all good. But the other thing I wanted to point out is that I'm not trying to deconvert anybody. That's not my mission. I appreciate that is some people's missions. And I find that people are often surprised, because I find people to be almost defensive in the face of conversations with atheists who are, people who are religious. And I don't know whether that is because people have been in their face about it or what. But what I want is to be able to express my beliefs as comfortably and freely as they feel they can express their beliefs. And they don't seem to recognize, and I think it's hard for people in America to recognize how privileged religious people are, even religious minorities, in the way that they can freely talk about their beliefs until it becomes, I don't believe in any of that. And then suddenly that is beyond the pale. When I mentioned that our social justice initiative, Jews for a Secular Democracy, is pluralistic, that word pluralism, when I worked in the Jewish community before this position, and I was working at a pluralistic Jewish organization, and I went to many pluralistic events, what I found was that pluralism often in the Jewish community means from Orthodox all the way to like Reconstructionist. But if it's flat out secular and they want representation as secular people, I almost never saw that. In a few instances, I have seen where organizations, including like Hillel International, which is the big Jewish campus organization, I saw a couple of years ago, put out a graphic on Instagram with a blessing for some, I forgot what occasion. They did a theistic one and they did a humanistic one right after it. And I thought, this is inclusion, right? And I've seen that every so often. I feel like we've kind of gained some momentum in getting folks to recognize that you can do both, right? You expand your tent by acknowledging that we can provide language for folks who want to say it traditionally and language for folks who want to use something that doesn't reference the supernatural. And so that's been that part about widening the tent and including secular folks. That's why I'm sitting at the Jewish Social Justice Roundtable. And there have definitely been times where I feel like I'm the open atheist in the room, and they kind of like will say something that is just so common and comfortable to be said in Jewish, even liberal Jewish settings about God and so on. And then they'll kind of look over to me and throw something in that makes it more inclusive. And so that, which I appreciate. And I'm glad that I'm in the room, because if I wasn't, I don't think they would be thinking about it. But when we work together on social justice issues, we're able to ask for language that is inclusive. So for example, I get a lot of sign-on letters, and many of them begin with phrases like, as people of faith, comma, here's what we're asking for. And I asked them to simply say, as people of faith and conscience, comma, and they're more than happy to add that. Nobody of faith objects to people of conscience. And so that allows us to feel included. In the Jewish community, there's often a reference to, because God created all of us in his image, as a way to be inclusive for LGBTQ equality. And I'm all for LGBTQ equality, but I can't sign on to something that states as fact, because God created us all in his image. So I asked them, will they edit that to say, because our tradition teaches that God created us all in his image. And that's a fact. So I can sign that because our tradition teaches that. I don't believe in that tradition, but it's factual to say that emerges from the Jewish tradition. So they make, in most cases, they make those edits. In some of the stuff, there are some lawsuits around abortion lately, since Roe v. Wade was overturned, that take a religious discrimination perspective. In other words, you're imposing one version of Christian understanding of when life begins on all of us other religions. And they get sign-ons from not just Jews, but Muslim and Hindu and so on. And they would, I requested in one particular case, can you include me as a humanist? And they didn't, and they wouldn't. And they felt like it would have hurt their case to include non-religious people in this case against one religion dominating the other. And that hurt. And I didn't sign on, obviously, which, I can play both sides of the fence and say, all right, I'm signing on as a Jew and as a religious minority as being Jewish, but I won't if I'm not included in the language. So still a lot of work to do on that front.
Oh, it's because that's something that we talk about a lot on our podcast, is the idea of not throwing the baby out with the bathwater. Like, we as secular folks, or maybe just me individually, increasingly I find myself not wanting to talk about how religion should not be. Like, I increasingly find myself less anti-theist, only because the problems that face our society, especially here in America, are so insidious and anti-humanist that I would rather ally with the people that are themselves humanists or humanist adjacent, such that we all can survive. And then there can be, again, a society where we can have these polite disagreements and discussion about, is your religion true, or what's the value of this religious belief, or that sort of thing. But I find myself wanting to shelve all of those discussions in favor of, oh, you believe in climate change? I believe in climate change. I don't care what religion you are. We got to do something about this together, because if that doesn't get addressed, then it doesn't matter who worships what God. We're all going to die.
Right. And I take that latter approach because we are just not big enough as secular Americans to do it ourselves.
No.
And liberal religion isn't either. But it is a real tension, and I wish there was more conversation about it. And I wish I had more time to be in conversation with folks about how do we bridge between liberal religion and the non-religious, because I have found that the liberal religious folks are extremely defensive when I have talked to them about not being a believer. And I feel like part of it is because they understand us even more than the fundamentalists, right? We're aliens to the fundamentalists. But for liberal religionists, they're in first of all, they're almost as new as we are, right? There were no liberal religions pre-Enlightenment, and there were almost no secular people pre-Enlightenment. So this is all relatively new. And their mission, as I see it, is to retain a religion that they can live with, right? So they live with the uncertainty of a God that doesn't answer their prayers, right? It certainly, and I know much more about liberal Judaism than the other religions' versions of liberal religion, but I have wonderful conversations with my colleagues at Reconstructionist Judaism, or Reconstructing Judaism as they've rebranded, because they say that we're very much aligned theologically, but they still use all the traditional liturgy. And I've heard from some of their rabbis that it's a metaphor, and they want to retain the God language as a metaphor, and God can mean all the good in the world. I was just in a conversation about the book When Bad Things Happen to Good People by Rabbi Kushner, which was a blockbuster book, where my take on it is, my shorthand is, everything good in the world is God and everything bad is not. and
sharpshooter fallacy.
Yeah. And they're still, I think, first of all, none of us are engaging people the way fundamentalists do, because all of us are willing to live with a degree of uncertainty that fundamentalists don't have to acknowledge. And for folks who are looking for certainty, fundamentalism is much more comfortable than either atheism or liberal religion, right? So so there's commonalities there that we can work on, but I do feel like we represent a real threat to liberal religions because I think they feel attacked. I think the other thing that's happening is there's a movement, right? So again, I'm much more familiar with it within Judaism, but I think this is what happens in other religions as well, which is we all started off as fundamentalists because before Enlightenment, religion was pretty hardcore everywhere. And then as people were able to leave the pathway that they take, maybe from fundamentalism to liberal religion to no religion. And certainly in the Jewish community, this has been studied, and nobody sheds more Jews than the Orthodox as a percentage, right? Something like 60% of American Jews who were born into Orthodox families are no longer Orthodox. So no other denomination has that kind of loss.
Crazy.
Yeah. And they go to conservative Judaism and Reform Judaism. And you can see the pathway that people are taking out. And the largest growing segment is no denomination at all, right? And that is not because they're fundamentalists. They're not on that side. They're on the other side of this equation of people leaving organized religion, but really going from the most extreme versions of religion through perhaps liberal religions and then out. And I think that is understood and seen as a threat for liberal religion. And I don't blame them, but I think we're all in the same boat as far as justifying, why are we doing this? You know, what's the benefit? Why would you bother? Why would you bother going to Reform Judaism any more than Humanistic Judaism? Like, we have our case to make. And I think for some people, it's going to be compelling, but I think Reform Judaism has a case to make as well. And they have to make the case. Because like I said before, there is no obligation anymore for people to have to be part of a religious community. So it's got to be, the case to be made has to be based on meaning, right? Why do this? What benefit do you get out of it? How does it make life better, either for you or for your family or for the world at large, right? And so that's the arguments I want to be working along, is that this does make my life better. You know, having my kids experience the connection to the heritage that I experience is a benefit for me, and I think will be a benefit for my kids. At the same time, they are experiencing another amazing heritage, which is their Japanese heritage, right?
Cool.
My kids go to Japanese school on Saturdays, and it's pretty intensive for them. It's Japanese language study. Yeah. We go to Japan, you know, when there's no pandemic, we go once a year. Their grandparents are there. They talk to their grandparents in Japanese. And so they're very connected to that side of their heritage. But I know from, you know, understanding and reading about it that people who are half Japanese have a hard time in Japan often because they're not fully accepted. And I certainly know that people who are half Jewish have had challenges to try to be part of the Jewish community. And so my kids are going to exist both in two worlds and maybe in neither. One of the things I did even before I had kids was set up the Japanese Facebook page to connect anything I found that was some convergence between Jewish and Japanese, which you'd be surprised. There's quite a bit. And so maybe once or twice a week, I'll post another article. And, you know, there's not a ton of people out there who are looking for that. But for the folks who are, and now there's been other people who are even more involved than me. And frankly, you know, I'm the white Ashkenazic half of a Japanese couple. I'm not Japanese myself, but I would call my kids Japanese. There are now Japanese people who are taking it on themselves to do other things with that moniker, but it is a new identity that didn't exist 100 years ago. And now, you know, it's still a very tiny group of people, but I'm pretty confident there are more Japanese people today than at any time in human history. And it's lovely to be able to have both. And should my kids end up marrying somebody who are half Guatemalan and half Italian, then their kids will have 4 heritages to choose from, and, you know, whatever they find meaning in, or skip it all and go to France and engage, you know. So I think there is still always, at least in our lifetimes and maybe for another 100 years or more, a tension between who is ethnically full or real versus the people who love the culture. You know, I'll never be Japanese, obviously. And my engagement with that culture, though, is pretty deep. But I know people who are in way deeper than me, and they'll never be Japanese, but they are fully immersed in Japanese culture. And if that's what gives them meaning, then I'm all for it. And so that was going back to who's a Jew question. If you're fully engaged in it, then, and you want to claim it, then you can claim it. I could actually become a Japanese citizen. It would still be silly at that point for me to say I'm Japanese, I think. But I think that's something that it will take the Japanese 100 years or more to get past that. But Jews are working past it because there are now more intermarried households in America containing like one Jewish spouse, one non-Jewish spouse, than there are households with 2 Jewish spouses. And that's been the case. That's been the case for more than a decade now. You would never guess that from the organized Jewish community because they're not going to acknowledge it or serve those people as a majority. And many of those households have nothing to do with the organized Jewish community, whether they've been pushed out or chosen to leave. But it's the majority now. Intermarried households are the majority. There are more children of intermarriage in America today under the age of 25 than there are Jews with 2 Jewish parents. So what do you do with that? You know, this notion of you don't look Jewish is now completely absurd, right? I actually look Jewish, based on those stereotypes, I may be able to pass for Italian, perhaps, but, because I grew up in Staten Island, but
right.
I would take pride, and I admit to this being like very ethnocentric, in having good Judar and being able to know when I walk on the streets of Manhattan who is and isn't, which is now, again, completely out the window and stereotyping and bad, right? And yet, and I have to give it up, and I am willing to give that up because my kids do not look Jewish, quote unquote, the way that old expression used to mean. And I want them to have a world in which they don't have to defend that. And in which, if they want to claim it for themselves, they can claim it for themselves. So they, on Sundays, they go to Jewish educational program near us. Saturdays, it's Japanese school. We have them way over program. They still get plenty of screen time, but, it's a lot, right? And it's because we want to engage on both aspects of our heritage. But lots of other families are not doing any of it, and maybe their kids will grow up and want it and have to discover it on their own, and hopefully we'll be there for them if that's what happens. But, that to me is what multiculturalism is about, and why we want to celebrate it and not get stuck in those kind of ethnocentric, here's how you stay Jewish. Just marry someone else who's Jewish. Then you don't have to do anything Jewish at all. And then you will retain your Jewish blah, blah, blah. I never bought into that. I think it's very destructive, and it's over. So now it's a question of, well, what does it mean? What does it mean to be Jewish and also celebrate Christmas with the other half of your family or Diwali or whatever else your other cultures are, and not have anyone tell you, well, that's going to quote unquote dilute your Judaism, because it doesn't.
Thank you so much, Paul.
Yay.
So if people want to hear more from you, if they want to learn more about the work you're doing, what do they do?
So definitely be in touch with me at shj.org. It's just my name, Paul Golin, at shj.org if you want to email me, or sign up for our free e-news on our website. We have a really lively discussion group on Facebook. If you search Humanistic Judaism Discussion on Facebook, we've got several thousand people talking about it, and it is very welcoming and inclusive, and lots of good answers there. If you have a question, please search the question first before you ask it, because the most common answer is search the group, because we've heard that question 100 times already. So, but it's a really good resource for folks. A lot of times it is people saying, I didn't even know this was an option, and I'm so glad to learn that this is, and to find my other people. And we do have a list of in-person communities at shj.org/find. If you're looking for in-person communities, we might be in your city, and get involved. We'd love to have you.
All right. So that is it. We need to thank Jonathan Zalbin and First Frame Music for the music for this podcast.
And here concludes this episode of The Family Skeptical, where nothing is sacred except for our kids.
I will get you the whole episode to listen to before it airs. So okay. My mom was a journalist for a while, believes it's always better to get feedback. So I think you were amazing. You've done this a million times before. If you hear it and there's anything you want different or changed,
okay,
I will do that.
All right. I won't. There's nothing I said that I regret. Usually I regret it immediately. So I don't
we have
remember.
A unicorn episode.
Yeah, I don't remember saying anything I regret. I didn't.
No.
It's all right. Okay.
Okay,
great.